Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the fourth session of our webinar series, Dismantling Anti-Blackness in Education. I'm Tambra Jackson, the Interim Dean for the School of Education at IUPUI, and I'm delighted to have you all present with us this evening. I'm looking forward to the conversation we get to have this evening with our panelists about anti-Black linguicism. As part of our mission, the School of Education is committed to examining our collective role in improving the human condition. And we do this with an explicit focus on social justice, inclusive of anti-racist and anti-oppressive perspectives and actions. Tonight's event is an opportunity for all of us to learn more about anti-Blackness in order to help inform our work and action for education equity. The specific focus on anti-Blackness for this series is intended to increase our understanding of what is at the root of why Black children lead many negative statistics in education and what we all can do to disrupt that narrative. As noted by Kiana Mariah Ross in her June 24th, 2020 op-ed in the New York Times, quote, "Racism fails to fully capture what Black people in this country are facing. The right term is anti-Blackness. To be clear, racism isn't a meaningless term, but it's a catch-all that can encapsulate anything from Black people being denied fair access to mortgage loans, to Asian students being burdened with a model minority label. It's not specific. Many Americans awakened by watching footage of Derek Chauvin killing George Floyd by kneeling on his neck are grappling with why we live in a world in which Black death loops in a tragic screenplay scored with the wails of childless mothers and the entitled indifference of our murderers. And an understanding of anti-Blackness is the only place to start. Anti-Blackness is one way some Black scholars have articulated what it means to be marked as Black in an anti-Black world. It's more than just racism against Black people. That oversimplifies and defangs it. It's a theoretical framework that illuminates society's inability to recognize our humanity, the disdain, disregard, and disgust for our existence," end quote. During this evening, we will have an opportunity to hear from our phenomenal featured panelists and pose questions to move our thinking and actions forward about anti-Black linguicism. We encourage you to use the chat function to dialogue with each other. And if you have a specific question for our panelists, please use the Q&A function. And now I'd like to pass the mic to our moderator for this evening, Dr. Kara Taylor.
Hello, everyone. Good evening, and thank you for logging in to be part of our webinar. I'm so honored to moderate this amazing conversation with four amazing scholars. As Prince said in his Soul Train Music Award, we're going to discuss the blessed Black people. This is a space that serves for us to interrogate and combat oppression. And this is a space for us to reimagine what it would be like to read, to speak, and to live the power that we really hold as Black people. So in this webinar, there will be four individuals with us that will educate us around tonight's topic of anti-Black linguicism. Each speaker has prepared 10 minutes of remarks, and allow me to introduce each presenter, starting with the first presenter. Dr. Gloria Boote, and I'm being fancy to pronounce it, is a Carolina Distinguished Professor at the University of South Carolina. For more than 3 decades, Dr. Boote's scholarship, teaching, and service have focused on equity pedagogies. She is the author and editor of 5 books: We Be Loving Black Children, Learning to Be Literate About African Diaspora Literacy, The Heart of Transformation in K-12 Schools and Teacher Education, 2019 ASA Critics' Choice Award, Educating African American Students and How Are the Children, resounding voices, school experiences of people from diverse ethnic backgrounds, and multicultural education, raising consciousness. She has received millions of dollars in grants and has nearly 100 publications. Dr. Boote has presented nationally and internationally on equity issues and has received prestigious awards such as Fulbright Scholar, Fulbright Specialist, 2020 National Council of Teachers of English in CTE, Outstanding Educator in the English Language Arts Elementary section, and the 2021 American Educational Research Association Division K Legacy Award. Dr. Boote is the founder and executive director of the Center for the Education and Equity of African American Studies. She has presented and or served as a visiting scholar internationally in every continent except Antarctica. Dr. Boote and Dr. George Johnson are the authors of the Doctor's Diaspora Curriculum. After following Dr. Gloria Boote will be Dr. April Baker Bale. Dr. April Baker Bale is a transdisciplinary teacher, researcher, activist, and associate professor of language, literacy, and English education in the Department of English and Department of African American and African Studies at Michigan State University. A national leader in conversations on Black language education. Her research interrogates the intersections of Black language and literacies, anti-Black racism, and anti-racist pedagogies, and is concerned with anti-racist writing, critical media literacies, Black feminist, womanist storytelling, and self-preservation for Black women in academia, with an emphasis on early career Black women. Baker Bale's award-winning book, Linguistic Justice, Black Language, Literacy, Identity, and Pedagogy, brings together theory, research, and practice to dismantle anti-Black linguistic racism, a term Baker Bale coined, and white linguistic supremacy. The book provides ethnographic snapshots of how Black students navigate and negotiate their linguistic and racial identities across multiple contexts. And it captures what anti-racist Black language pedagogy looks like in community with Black youth. Linguistic Justice features a range of multimodal examples and practices through instructional maps, charts, artwork, and stories that reflect the urgent need for anti-racist language pedagogies in our current social and political climate. Baker Bale is a recipient of many awards and fellowships, including the 2020 NCTE George Orwell Award for Distinguished Contributions to Honesty and Clarity in Public Language, the 2020 Michigan State University's Distinguished Partnership Award for Community Engaged Creative Activity, the 2019 Michigan State University Alumni Award for Innovation and Leadership in Teaching and Learning, and the 2018 AERA Language and Social Processes Early Career Scholar Award. Following Dr. Baker Bale will be Dr. Lamar Johnson. Dr. Johnson is an associate professor of language and literacy for linguistic and racial justice in the Department of English at Michigan State University. His work explores the intricate intersections of language literacy, anti-Black racism, Blackness, and education. He was a recipient of the 2017 Promising Researcher Award, the recipient of the 2018 Edwin Hopkins Award, and 2019 honorable mention for the Alan Purvis Award, all through the National Council of Teachers of English. His co-edited book, edited with Dr. Gloria Boote, Gwenda Green, and Dwana Smith, African Diaspora Literacy, the Heart of Transformation in K-12 Schools and Teacher Education, is published with the Lexington Books and received the 2019 Critics' Choice Book Award for the American Educational Studies Association. Last but not least, Dr. Trefinia Peel-Edie is Associate Dean for Equity, Inclusion, and Faculty and Associate Professor in Department of Language Literacy and Sociocultural Studies in the College of Education and Human Sciences at the University of New Mexico. She specializes in African American education and ethnographic research methods. Her research explores the role of language, culture, and community in African American student learning. Specifically, the range of knowledge African American students engage in the Black church context and the ways this knowledge bears on schooling experiences. Her scholarly recognition includes the Outstanding Dissertation Award from the American Educational Research Association's Division G, Social Context in Education, and fellowships from the Spencer Foundation. Received several awards and recognitions for her work in social justice, equity, and community service, including the UNM Outstanding Faculty of Color Award, Presidential Luminaria Award, and Sarah Bell Brown Community Service Award, and most recently, the 2020 Ministers Fellowship of Albuquerque and Vicinity Citizens Award. She has authored and co-authored a variety of articles and chapters in books. She is editor of the forthcoming volume, Integrating Home and Heritage Languages in Schools, Pedagogy, and Promise, with NCTE and Routledge Publishers. So these are some amazing panelists that we have here. My mouth is dry reading all the amazing things that you all have done. So we will begin by allowing, again, each presenter 10 minutes of remarks just to go through the presentation, and that will lead us into questions and answers from both me and the audience so we can engage these amazing scholars in what they have brought for us today. So we will begin, and we will have Dr. Boote to have the floor for the first 10 minutes of remarks.
Thank you. Thank you, Kara. And thank you, Dr. Tambra Jackson, for this wonderful series. I've sat in on a few of them, and they are outstanding and will make an important impact. I'm happy to be a part of this group of panelists as well. So is my screen showing? Good. Loving the Language, African American Language. That's actually the title of one of the chapters of my book, Educating African American Students. And the big theme is that we love African American language. And I think that'll be a big theme of what you will hear today. And that there is nothing wrong with it. It's the rule-governed language. And because we are entering the conversation in different spaces and places, I will kind of give an overview of some foundational things about African American language. But I wanted to start by saying it is one of the most sophisticated language varieties in the US. And it has features that other languages can only dream about, like that habitual be, and we be loving African American language. That means we love it in the past, in the present, in the future. That means it's perpetual. 7 days a week, 365, 66 days out of the year, 525,600 minutes. You can't make us not love the language. And so we want to invite people to love it. And I have a picture of a family here. It's pretty amazing that when babies are born, their main way of communicating is crying. And yet by the time a child goes to school, that child is proficient in the language of the home. And that's quite amazing. So we want to remember that the language connects us to our family and to our culture. You will hear African American language referred to by many terms. I prefer African American language, but other people might say Black English, African American English, Ebonics, and a host of other terms. I really don't like to discuss language when I don't have much time because people bring really strong emotions about the topic. In fact, linguist John Ball says people, educators, typically fall into two categories. Either they love the language or they hate it. And a lot of what they feel is sort of based on what they know, based on their own experiences, and it's not based on a body of literature. Yet, even in 1933, we know from the work of people like Dr. Carter G. Woodson in The Miseducation of the Negro that African American language is a rich rule-governed language. And he talks about how when African American students went to school, they were made to scoff at their own language. And so that means even people who speak the language themselves don't recognize the beauty of the language. They often saw it as a broken down tongue rather than a language that had a rich linguistic history. And he said, you know, that learning that language is certainly more important than learning other languages like French or Spanish and so forth. And so there is, as I said, a huge body of literature out there. And so one of the things that people can do is kind of reach out. This is a picture of just a few of the many works that are out there, including Dr. Geneva Smithman, who is the top social linguist on this topic, and other people you see, including April Baker Bell, who you're going to hear from, but lots of work out there. I can't even capture it all. Some of the earlier works, Lorenzo Turner, Africanisms in the Gullah dialect. And so there are lots of works out there which people can kind of learn more about. So one of the first things I like to say when I talk about the language, because I know people have really strong emotions, is that it's not just Dr. Boote talking. The Linguistic Society of America, the largest linguistic society in the world, has gone on record several times, as has other professional organizations, to verify that African American language is systematic and is rule governed. And at the time of the Ebonics debate, there was more than 30 years of research. Now there's more than 50 years of research out there. And yet, one of the things that we know, I've been teaching for about 3 decades, and often pre-service and in-service teachers will say, I never knew this was a rule-governed language. So there's a huge disconnect between the body of literature and the practices in K-20 settings. So when we refer to African American language as broken English or lazy or slang, that is incorrect and it's demeaning. In fact, it is an attack on the humanity of the person, because language is how we connect and how we relate to other people in our family and in our community and in our world. And as Michael Eric Dyson says, every conversation about Black speech is a conversation about Black intelligence and humanity. And so these are 2 articles I'm referencing that I did with Dr. Johnson, who's here, and Dr. Bryan. And we identified ways that when our children go to school, like Carter G. Woodson mentioned, that they are subjected to lots of trauma and lots of violence. And we talked about 5 different kinds. And when we talk about the attacks on African American language, that is a form of linguistic violence. And that is defined as any attacks on the language or any ways that people marginalize or over police the language that is a form of violence. When we devalue the connection between language and race, and when we privilege standardized English, these things are forms of violence. African American language, like every other language, has features like phonology, syntax, semantic, pragmatics, and so forth. I just wanted to show you a few quick examples and try to explain and make it a little clearer. So like, for example, you often hear words like ask and ask, but pronounced as ax, and there are reasons for that, but I'm gonna just focus on that TH sound. That TH phoneme did not exist in West African languages. So when Africans came to this country and had to learn how to say the word, and again, they used their own language system. So with becomes with or wit or wid. And this is not unusual for people to use their first language and memories to pronounce words. We see it with French people. A French speaking person who also does not have the TH phoneme will pronounce with as whiz. Open the door. I'm going with you. This is mine. And people think that's very beautiful because they don't understand that's the same linguistic rule. Other things about African American language, I mean, you can have more than one negative. So it's a rich language, and that's not unique. French is one example I have up here, but there are several languages that have double negation. So there's nothing wrong with the way we be talking. I mean, in terms of, what happens with verb tense, there's a rule, a linguistic rule, that you keep it regular throughout. So you see for African American language at the bottom there, it is all the way through. There's no switching. In terms of semantics, the rule is the vocabulary is generative. And so this is why people think it's just slang, but it's way more than slang, because every language system has slang. But there's a suspension of literal definitions. And in terms of pragmatics, the rules for what's polite and what's not polite, the big rule is impress. And that draws from Black culture. So, put a little verb, you can signify, you can co-narrate, you can do all of these things. But again, it shows that African American language is linguistically sound. And other issues that you will hear about, the relationship between race and language, and how, unfortunately, many African American language speakers have internalized messages that there's something wrong with their language. And then the other part of loving the language is understanding that it is a co-parallel language to standardized English. It's not just a language we use to get to standardized English. And we understand the more languages we know, the richer we are. I want to conclude with two quotes. Everybody has seen The Color Purple or read the book. This is a beautiful example from the book about the two characters, Darlene and Celie, who are sisters. And Celie is learning to read, and she says, Darlene trying to teach me how to talk. Every time I say something the way I say it, she corrects me until I say it some other way. Pretty soon, it feels like I can't think. My mind run up on a thought, get confused, run back down, and sort of lay down. You sure this worth it? I asked. She says yes. So the only reason she's even trying this thing is because of her relationship with her sister. Bring me a bunch of books, white folks all over them talking about apples and dogs. What I care about the dogs, I think, but I let Darlene worry on. Sometimes I think about the apples and dogs, and sometimes I don't. And that speaks to the relevance of what African American children are reading and seeing in school. She says, look like to me, only a fool would want you to talk in a way that feels peculiar to your mind. And then I'll give Toni Morrison the last word. She says, we don't want to lose that language. It's the thing we love so much. She says, the worst of all possible things that could happen would be to lose that language. And it's terrible to think that a child with 5 different present tenses come to school to be faced with books that are less than his own language. And then to be told about his language, which to him, that are sometimes permanently damaging. This is really a cruel fallout of racism.
Thank you so much, Dr. Boote, for laying down an overview of African American language, resistance of African American language, and foundational concepts for African American language. And that opens us up for conversations of how this is applied in the world too, with our next presenters also. So following Dr. Boote will be Dr. Baker Bale, and she will have her 10 minutes of remarks. You have the floor.
All right, thank you. So first of all, I want to shout out and express my gratitude to Dr. Tambra Jackson, Laverne Johnson, and Dr. Kara Taylor and their colleagues for organizing this panel and inviting me to speak at Indiana University School of Education alongside my esteemed colleagues. And shout out to Dr. Boote for that nice overview. I think there's so many parallels to what I'm going to talk about in my presentation. So I want to thank everybody for carving out space to be here this evening as well, because I know it's on my side of town, it's kind of late. So I thank everybody for coming out. The title of my presentation is Linguistic Justice, Black Language Literacy, Identity, and Pedagogy. This presentation is based on ideas from my recently published book, which is a teacher, researcher, activist project that I did with Black students in Detroit. Before going further, I want to offer a land acknowledgement. I want to acknowledge the Ojibwe, the Anishinaabe peoples whose ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands I currently reside on here in Michigan. Land acknowledgements are powerful and important statements that allow us to respect and affirm the ongoing relationships between Indigenous people and land. But I also recognize that colonialism is a current ongoing process, and we need to be mindful of our current participation. As a descendant of enslaved Africans and a Black language and literacy researcher and educator, I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge my ancestors' relationship with language and land. 500 years ago, European enslavers and African middlemen raided villages and homes in various parts of Africa to abduct African people for the transatlantic slave trade. In addition to kidnapping, beating, abusing, and sexually exploiting African people, enslavers used language planning as a tool to separate captive Africans who spoke the same language as a way to minimize rebellion. Women, men, and children were separated from their loved ones and loaded onto slave ships, leaving behind their freedom, their humanity, their homelands, their families, their cultural traditions, and their languages. After a traumatic journey from West Africa to the New World, enslaved Africans who survived the Middle Passage arrived to the Caribbean, the Americas, and various parts of Europe, chained together without a shared language to communicate with one another, or the ability to communicate in their oppressor's language. In her book, Teaching to Transgress, Bell Hooks thinks about the trauma enslaved Africans must have felt about the loss of their language and a terrifying sound of the English language. She writes, "I think now of the grief of displaced homeless Africans forced to inhabit a world where they saw folks like themselves inhabiting the same skin, the same condition, but who had no shared language to talk with one another, who needed the oppressor's language. When I imagined the terror of Africans on board slave ships, on auction blocks, inhabiting the unfamiliar architecture of plantations, consider that this terror extended beyond fear of punishment, that it resided also in the anguish of hearing a language they could not comprehend." So in addition to linguistic isolation, enslaved Africans who were dispersed in the United States were intentionally denied access to literacy by law. Still, they needed to learn the language of this land to help build the physical, cultural, and intellectual foundations of this nation. Despite losing contact with their native language and it being illegal to teach them to read and write, enslaved Africans created a language out of remnants of their mother tongues and pieces and parts of the English language. This language not only provided a way for enslaved Africans to communicate among each other, but it also provided the means of communication that could not be fully understood by their oppressors. Fast forward to today, we use language planning in schools that essentially penalizes Black children for using the counter language that our ancestors were forced to create instead of white mainstream English, the language of conquest and domination. Despite there being decades of research on Black language and its survival since enslavement and its linguistic imprint on the nation and globe, Black people and Black language scholars keep having to remind the people that it is a legit language. James Baldwin said it best in the New York Times in 1979 when he wrote, "If Black English isn't a language, then tell me what is." Like every naturally used language, Black language is systematic with regular rules at the lexical, phonological, and grammatical level. Smitherman defines it as a style of speaking English words with Black flavor, with Africanized semantic, grammatical, pronunciation, and rhetorical patterns. Dr. Boote just helped us understand some of that earlier. Yet, non-linguists love to pick and choose who is speaking correct, proper, or standard English and who is not. But I have some not so new news for y'all. Standard English is a myth. Yep, linguists have long argued that the notion of a standard language is hypothetical, socially constructed, and is maintained by those with shallow understanding of human language. Indeed, if you ask anyone to define or describe standard English, many would define it using arbitrary rules that reflect language superiority. The belief that there is a homogeneous standard one-size-fits-all language is a myth that normalizes white ways of speaking English, and it is used to justify discrimination on the basis of language and race. This is why throughout my work and within this presentation, I deliberately use terms Black language and white mainstream English, not to uphold or perpetuate a linguistic or racial binary, but to foreground the relationship between language, race, anti-Black racism, and white linguistic supremacy. It was through my research with Black youth in Detroit and Black students in developmental writing courses that compelled me to begin using terms that more explicitly captured the intersections between language and race. By linking the racial classifications Black and white to language, I'm challenging us to see how linguistic hierarchies and racial hierarchies are interconnected. That is, people's language experiences are not separate from their racial experiences. Indeed, the way Black language is devalued in classrooms reflects how Black lives are devalued in the world. Similarly, the way white mainstream English, or what some of y'all like to call standard English, is privileged and deemed the norm in many classrooms is directly connected to the invisible ways that white culture is deemed normal, neutral, and superior in the world. I use Black language intentionally in my scholarship to acknowledge Africologist theories that maintain that Black speech is the continuation of African and American context. I also use Black language politically to align with the mission of Black liberation movements like Black Lives Matter, because no doubt the anti-Blackness that is used to diminish Black language and Black students in classrooms is not separate from the rampant and deliberate anti-Black racism and violence inflicted upon Black people in society. Like the mission of Black Lives Matter, I see Black linguistic justice as a call to action, a call to radically imagine and create a world free of anti-Blackness, a call to create an education system where Black students, their language, their literacies, their culture, their creativity, their joy, their imagination, their brilliance, their freedom, their existence, and their resistance matters. But let's not forget, Black language is also the language that continuously gets appropriated and exploited in classrooms and in the world, as we can see. Since I began my research in 2008, I've collected numerous examples of what I'm calling Black linguistic appropriation in the ways that Black language and literacies have been capitalized on. There are many examples of fashion designers who've capitalized on Black language to create market messages to invite consumers to buy their products. And I cannot tell you how many times I've walked into retail stores that sold t-shirts, mugs, hats, and pillows that have capitalized on or appropriated Black language. And you can see the pictures on the screen. Commercials do it too. So I just want to take a moment. You probably have seen this commercial that uses the rap group Outkast's song, I Like the Way You Move, to advertise their products. The commercial is going to show a white man cheerful and dancing to Outkast's music on a dance floor in front of a majority white audience. So I'll play that really fast.
Before Voltaren Arthritis Pain Gel, my husband would have been on the sidelines, but not anymore.
Oh, is it showing?
An alternative to pills, Voltaren is the first full prescription strength non-steroidal anti-inflammatory gel to target pain directly at the source.
It's moving, but yeah,
It's moving?
it's playing, but the video's not moving.
Okay. All right. You probably see it. It's on TV right now. Y'all probably could catch it. But it's just one example of what I'm calling Black linguistic appropriation. You might remember when Snickers used the Black lexical slang word cray-cray to personalize their rappers. And let's not forget about the growing number of white Instagram celebrities who are making a come up off of Black language and literacy and culture. Yet as my research shows in classrooms, Black language is devalued and viewed as a symbol of linguistic and intellectual inferiority. So essentially what this says is it's acceptable for Black language to be used and capitalized on by non-native speakers of Black language, but Black people can't use it in communities and classrooms. This is unfortunate, but unsurprising because Black language is one of those features of Black culture that white America loves to hate, yet loves to take.
2 minutes.
2 minutes, all right. So I'm gonna move on to the next slide really quick because I wanna talk about this code switching thing. In my work, I talk about anti-Black linguistic racism, which describes the linguistic violence that my colleague Lamar Johnson is going to come on and talk a little bit about. But it describes the experiences that Black children and Black people have in the world when using their language. And classrooms, and specifically, I think a lot about how anti-Blackness is embedded in this idea of code switching. That's one of the most common approaches used in classrooms and communities when addressing Black students' language practices. So in classrooms, teachers often embrace the code switching approach without interrogating why Black students and other students of color are required to code switch into white mainstream English. According to most dictionaries and our collective understanding, a code is a system of symbols used to represent assign often secret meanings. So what secret meanings are we asking our Black students to represent when we tell them to code switch? The code switching approach basically posits that teachers should treat Black students' linguistic practices as equally as possible, but should encourage them to code switch to sound more white to avoid discrimination. The problem with this approach as applied in most classrooms is that it encourages students to code switch without any regard to their racial realities or the role that anti-Black linguistic racism play and why they are being asked to code their language. It's also important to interrogate code switching in light of our current racial and political climate. So in many classrooms, Black students are encouraged to code switch as a strategy for survival. However, the students I worked with in Detroit contested this belief. They questioned, how could code switching be a form of survival or self-protection when Black people are being discriminated against and killed based on the color of their skin? So I was working in classrooms of Black youth when Trayvon Martin was murdered by George Zimmerman. And the students questioned, well, Trayvon Martin said, what are you following me for? That didn't protect him from being murdered. And we tend to think of that as standard English, right? We see repetitive instances of this happening. Michael Brown, who said, I don't have a gun, stop shooting, and he was still gunned down. We have Eric Gardner, who said, I cannot breathe 11 times before he was put in a chokehold by a New York police officer. The students thinking about Trayvon Martin also make me think about Black people who didn't even have an opportunity to open their mouth, like Breonna Taylor, Atatiana Jefferson, Ayanna Stanley Jones, Tamir Rice, and other Black people who didn't even have a chance to say anything. These instances are clear reminders that code switching will not save Black people and cannot solve racial or linguistic injustice, and we cannot pretend that it does. My students' interrogation of the relationship between language, racial violence, and teaching instruction compels us to ask questions. If using white ways of speaking English cannot protect Black people from losing their lives, why are we telling Black children that code switching is a strategy for survival? Many classrooms do not allow opportunities to ask and answer critical questions about who makes these decisions and why are students of color only required to code switch and white students are not. And not to grammar shame former President Donald Trump, but let's keep it real. We have watched this president not live up to the language standards that many teachers use in classrooms to measure Black, Brown, and Indigenous students by. How can we continue to tell Black students and other linguistically marginalized students that they need to use standard English over the brilliance of their native tongue to get a job or to be successful, when according to some studies, the former president of the United States grammar is at the 5th grade level? Let's be honest, Trump did not need to code switch or live up to the standards of white mainstream English to be elected as president, because being a white man took precedence over his grammar. How dare us gaslight Black students and Black people in this way? How dare us mislead them to believe that using white mainstream English will protect them from racial discrimination? But truth be told, Black students understand while they can switch their language, they cannot switch their skin. And this is why our English language arts and writing classrooms and in the community, we have to move beyond simply talking about the technical differences between language. We have to start talking about the relationship between language, race, anti-Black racism, and white linguistic supremacy. I have so much more, but I'm gonna leave y'all here because you need to hear from the other two panelists. I will put some things in the chat, some resources that you could look to if you're wanting to know, what am I arguing for? I'll put the links in the chat and you can go check that stuff out. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Dr. Baker-Bell. And I'm also following up questions that will allow for us to talk about how these things materialize too, right after all presentations. So thank you for talking about anti-Black linguistic racism in the classroom and in communities, and also its connection with racial violence. So we are moving on to our next presenter. We have Dr. Johnson, who will have 10 minutes for his remarks.
So today, first I want to say much love to Dr. Jackson, Dr. Kara Taylor, and also Laverne Johnson and the University for inviting me to be a panelist. Much love to all of you for joining today. And most importantly, much love to our Black, Brown, and Indigenous babies, children, and youth. We do this work with and for you. Today, my talk is titled Blackness Is, Blackness Ain't, Critical Race English Education. So first I want to talk about the intersections of Blackness, anti-Black violence, racial violence, language and literacy in educational classrooms. So I want to talk about these meditations on Blackness, because so often we think about Blackness is viewed as something that's evil, that is negative and less than, and we say the same for Black language. So I believe we got to begin to think about Blackness as a meditation. When I say meditations, it serves as an action and practice for positive thinking, awareness about Blackness, especially when we live in a world where Blackness is met with malice, hatred, and hostility. When I think about Blackness, Blackness is beautiful. It's also revolutionary. And when I think about Blackness, love is at the center of Blackness, and same with Black language. It rests within Blackness. And that we can't have revolution without love, and we can't have love without Blackness and Black language. So moving forward, I want to share with you a meditation that I wrote on Blackness titled Blackness Is, Blackness Ain't. So I quickly read this to you. Black is love. Black is beautiful. Black is joy. Black is fierce. Black is aggressive, but Black is also peaceful. Black ain't evil. Black ain't torture. Black ain't soulless. Black is soul. Black is unapologetic. Black is free. Black ain't afraid. Black ain't monolithic. Black ain't endless. Black is gentle. Black is complex, but Black is also simple. Black is resilient. Black is strength. Black is vibrant. Black is opulent. Black is light, but Black is also dark. Black is smooth. Black is delicate. Black is rough. Black is off the chain. Black is dope. Black is magical. Black is limitless. So with that being said, I raised the following question. I'm going to move this out your way. I'm going to just switch you around right quick. Can y'all see that still? I'm going to keep it going. So I raised the following questions. What does it mean to love the hell out of Blackness, especially when we live in a world that misreads our Blackness, misrepresents our Blackness, and paints a negative image of our Blackness? Blackness is an embodied experience that's connected to Black people's culture, race, ethnicity, language, literacies, and ways of life. It's an act of self-care, collective care, and resistance. Blackness is not monolithic. Instead, it is dynamic, fluid, and complex. Blackness is also intersectional. It looks at disability, spirituality, religion, race, and ethnicity. And so when I think about Blackness and my Black language are off the chain. They're dope. I don't view them through the white gaze. I view them through the Black gaze. And when I view my Black language and Blackness through the Black gaze, it's wild and free. It's not bound by the chains of whiteness and white supremacy. And so often in educational classrooms, when we think about Blackness and Black language, it's viewed through this white imagination. And by this, I mean, it centers around like white logic, white ways of thinking, being, existing, and speaking in these spaces. And so I even can think about Toni Morrison, shout out to her, today's her birthday. She talks about the white literary imagination and how even in English language arts classroom, English education, language and literacy studies, we see how whiteness is coddled and protected through the books we teach, through how we teach language, how we teach writing in those spaces. And so I believe that leads to the spiritual murder and the symbolic violence of Black students' humanity in these spaces. And so just keeping it real, the anti-Black racism and state-sanctioned violence that are raging in the streets, that we see raging in church, in the parks, on playgrounds, are no strangers to the classroom. And so by this, I mean that the block is hot. We talk about how the block is hot in neighborhoods and communities, and the block is hot is also Black language. And it used to let people know that, police are right around the corner and they're up to no good. So just like Black bodies and lives are being over-policed and surveilled in neighborhoods, they're also being over-policed and surveilled, in classrooms when we over-police their language, when we silence their voices, when we look at the way they dress, even the color of their skin. So the block is also hot in the classroom. So Dr. Boote has already gone over this chart. So I'm going to just keep it moving here. And so get to the importance of why we need to combat anti-Black violence in school spaces. So this is a theory that I coined and created, also methodology and pedagogy called critical race English education, what I'm calling CRE. Because so often, we need to think about how Black lives are mattering in school spaces, how Black lives matter in English education, how Black lives matter in ELA classrooms. And so when I think about CRE, it looks at the intersections of anti-Black racism, violence, but also Blackness too. And so we need to begin to see the brilliance and beauty in Blackness when we think about Black language and the Black literacy that our Black youth bring to these classrooms. And so here's some guiding questions that I use to guide my thoughts around CRE. How are Black lives matter in the ELA classrooms? How are white supremacy and anti-Black racism reinscribed through our disciplinary discourses and pedagogical practices? Whose identities are included and reflected in ELA curriculum pedagogies? How are curricula and pedagogies inclusive of Black youth? However, using Black youth life histories and experiences to inform our mindset, curriculum, and pedagogical practices in the classroom. And so quickly, CRE addresses issues of race, racism, whiteness, white supremacy, and power within school, but also out of school spaces. It pushes back against the dominant text, these canonical texts, but also canonical artwork and media texts. And it highlights the beauty and brilliance and Blackness in ELA classrooms. And this is what I really do love about CRE, that it builds on the Black literacies that Black youth bring to classrooms, which affirm the lives, spirit, and language and knowledge of Black people and Black culture. Black literacies are grounded in Black liberatory thought. Black literacies push back against like what we classify as literacy, not just what we see in print, but also tattoos, poems, novellas, graphic novels, technology, social media sites, oral histories and storytelling, body movements, dance, music, and prose. All these things can be viewed as a text. Also, Black literacies counter anti-Blackness by showcasing an unapologetic, unashamed, and unconditional love for Blackness and for Black lives. And so you can't do this work around CRE if you haven't done the soul work. It's not a cookie cutter way to do this work. It's not a step-by-step way to do this work. So you have to begin to reimagine what education looks like. You have to begin to reimagine what language and literacy, what they look like in ELA classrooms. So I want to briefly talk about and close with the radical imagination. And so when I say the radical imagination, it's a method of thought and an embodied experience where one begins to reimagine the world in which we live and understanding how issues from the past, such as sexism, racism, xenophobia, whiteness, white supremacy, patriarchy, how those things actually dangle in our present moment and will inform our future. Dave Stovall talks about how, not in the sense of reform, but to embrace the spirit of the radical imaginary that affirms something different can be created. It is a fugitive space, a space where building requires tearing down in order to make anew.
2 minutes.
And so in closing, I want to talk about Black joy and close with Black joy. So I'm going to read with you the last paragraph. So in closing, this presentation is about new visions and new possibilities for Black youth. Even though Black youth are maneuvering in a racially stratified society that don't see them as human, they still possess and practice Black joy. In her 2019 live album titled Homecoming, Beyonce reminds the people that Black joy is filled with so much damn swag. She asserts, and the amount of swag is just limitless. Like the things that these young people can do with their bodies and the music they can play, and the drum rolls and the haircuts and the bodies and the it's just not right. It's just so much damn swag. For instance, Black graduate swag surfing during high school and college graduations are the epitome and embodiment of Black joy. When I say Black joy, I'm referring to the type of joy that originates in resistance, joy that is discovered and making a way out of no way, joy that is uncovered when you know how to love yourself and others. Black joy is when Black folks actively work to stay human through showcasing an unapologetic love for Blackness, Black beauty, and Black life. Black joy is the prototype for creating a better tomorrow. We can't demand the world we want to see without Black joy, and we can't embrace Black joy without embodying the radical imagination. So in closing, I open with the meditation called Black Is, Black Ain't. And I want to close with the closing meditation. When you imagine a perfect world, what does the perfect world look like? How does it smell? How does it feel? How do joy, radical love, Black language, Black literacies, and Black futures fit into your perfect world? Thank you.
Thank you so much for providing us some of the materialized ways in which we can address this equity of language and including African American language and Black language and Black English within classroom spaces too. I will double back with some questions that I have for each of you after we finish presentations. So last but not least, we have Dr. Pia Edie following with her 10 minutes of remarks.
Okay, I just want to begin and thank everyone for organizing, everyone who was responsible for organizing tonight's events. I'm just delighted and enamored with my colleagues and everything I've learned tonight. I'm just excited to be here and with such brilliant minds. As we think together about ways to address anti-Blackness and linguistic violence toward African-American learners who speak African-American language, I offer that the Black Church provides African-American children with a range of social, cultural, and linguistic resources that youth bring with them as assets to the classroom. And these assets are grounded in African-American culture and language, knowledge, skills, and dispositions deeply rooted in African-American language and culture. And that if leveraged, can support in-school learning and language and literacy practices. I want to draw your attention to the following ideas: that Black youth have valuable knowledge-producing experiences outside of school and community contexts that inform what they do in school and what these experiences shape up to be. At the center of positive teaching and learning are the relationships that African-American learners have with adults and their peers. Teachers can positively build on these experiences by choosing to see the brilliance in African-American learners and integrating similar knowledge forms and understandings into regular programs of instruction. And to my mind, this is the anecdote. My study of the Black church Sunday school community in Northern California anchors this work. In this study, I explore the ways in which youth ages 9 to 12 were socialized to membership or a membership identity in this community, and ultimately how they became communicatively competent, or in other words, how they came to know what they needed to know in order to be successful in this setting. I was particularly interested in the identities that children took up as learners and the messages they received about themselves, their community, and their place in society. And more to the point, the ways language mediated these processes. The Black church has represented a core of institutional life and identity formation for many African Americans in the United States. A number of scholars have documented its significant contributions to the African American community. PBS is currently running a special on the Black church hosted by Dr. Henry Louis Gates. Check it out if you can, it's fabulous. Research links the Black church to a host of benefits for African-American youth: positive self-identity development, self-connectedness, fostering resilience, perseverance, and self-actualization. Not to mention better school attendance, higher grades in schools, fewer disciplinary referrals, stronger parental involvement, and access to opportunities and resources that might not otherwise be available. Language and literacy are among these resources. And yet schools and teachers consistently miss the mark in acknowledging these literacy practices as academically legitimate and rich, or recognizing them as relevant to in-school learning. I understand African-American children's engagement with the Bible and other church-based texts, such as Sunday school materials, the morning worship sermon, and even the church bulletin, to have a certain vitality. Consider this: the Bible is a collection of complex texts, and scripture is literature and literary in both character and consequence. Specifically, scriptural texts then embody the characteristic form, content, and function found in all recognized literature: beauty, value, and effect. And it encompasses 9 principal artistic discourse features found in literature: unity, diversity, rhetoricity, structure, patterning, foregrounding, imagery, phonicity, and dramatics. Inasmuch as they are academically rich, compelling, and complex texts, reading the scriptures provides African-American learners with access to very sophisticated and amplified language forms and practices on top of what they already own through their own language and discourse and understandings. In this case, the King James Version of the Bible, which is what was used in this community, is the most widely translated and referenced text of our time. The responsive reading is one example where the reading of the scriptural text is quite pronounced. The responsive reading is call and response, essentially a turn-taking reading of scriptural text by a lead speaker and the congregation as a whole. Often, a child leads this activity. Several aspects of this text in printed form are worth noting. This text is performed with the same genre of prose and intonation, cadence, and expression that youth will confront in schools in the works of William Shakespeare, Charles Dickens, Mark Twain, and not to mention Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech, and our former President Barack Obama, Yes, I Can speech. A look at the text pronounced in the responsive reading reveals a range of literary elements and figurative language meant to evoke a certain kind of feeling among congregants and convey a particular message and effect toward the text. The Lord is thy keeper. The sun shall not smite thee by day, nor the moon by night. Here's what I've learned from this work. Language and interaction serve to nurture young people's sense of value and belonging, as well as their social and linguistic competence. A strategically focused structure of activities deliberately cultivates positive experiences and affords youth opportunities to demonstrate learning in ways that are collaborative, ways that build on their cultural knowings, and that center African American language, discourse, and ways of being as very good things. The Black church as a rich cultural space that offers Black youth language and literacy opportunities on which teachers can build too. In this context of anti-Blackness, the Black church provides African American youth with a safe space to acquire and demonstrate knowledge with the support of adults who are genuinely invested in them, a space where learners have freedom to be competent and capable, to show up and show out unapologetically just as they are. We need only to find ways to build on these assets, higher order thinking skills, and integrate similar knowledge forms into school instruction. More to the point, I think Lisa Delpis said it best. When we educators look out at the classroom of Black faces, we must understand that we are looking at children at least as brilliant as those from any well-to-do white community. If we do not recognize the brilliance before us, we cannot help but carry on the stereotypic societal views that these children are somehow damaged goods and that they cannot be expected to succeed. Let's choose to see the brilliance in African American learners. Thank you.
So right on time. Thank you, Dr. Peel Edie, for talking about African American language, Black language within a community context of a church too, outside of schools, because there's other spaces other than just classrooms in which this conversation is important to talk about. So I will be transitioning to the question and answer portion of this webinar. I formulated 2 questions. However, we are also taking questions from the audience. So you can use the Q&A function that's found in your toolbar to ask questions for the presenters. But I will pose mine and I will start speaking and saying the questions as they appear in the Q&A function too. So I had a question. I'm going to reorder them now that we've presented. I know that Dr. Johnson got to speak into this a bit, but I wanted to open this up for everyone to be able to talk about this. When we're thinking about loving Black English or loving African American language or meditating on Blackness through linguistic practices, what are ways in which, effective ways, we can address this in the classroom? So how does that look in the classroom to love Black language, Black English, African American language, and in community spaces too? So I want to open it up more expansively too. How does that look?
I'll go. I mean, I think that the first thing is not to police it. You know what I mean? I think that's what Dr. Johnson is getting at, not to police the language. I think loving it for me meant to connect Black history with it, so that when I help Black children to understand how their language is connected to the very reason we're here in this country, to think about enslavement, they would say things like, I didn't even know, you know what I mean? We had a language, I didn't even know. Why wouldn't we learn this in school? Like, it was liberating for them to understand that history, because without it, in that context, Black children are left just to believe that they're speaking some type of substandard version of the English language in which they're not. So I think connecting the history, I think not policing it because it's brilliance in the language. In fact, I think what Dr. Boote got to with the Toni Morrison quote, when she said kids with 5 different present tenses come to school, to be taught something that's lower than their language. I mean, Black language is so brilliant, you know what I mean? To bring it down to one mode, to try to get us to bring our language down to a white mainstream English or a one version of a language is very difficult to do. Like there's some things that Dr. Geneva Smitherman talks about, and we notice as Black people, you can't communicate back. There's some things I can't tell you, like if I'm saying it in Black language, you just might not get it. So I think stop policing Black children's language and let them play, let them experiment, let them, deal with the brilliance of their language in a classroom. And I think that that's the first step.
And I will also add to that and just say, thinking about going back to, once again, redefining what Blackness is, because so often it's seen as something that's negative. So seeing the beauty, brilliance in Blackness and bringing it to the classroom spaces, which requires us to go through a deep soul work. We have to do the soul work. You have to basically, your old self has to die and be born again. You have to be a new way of speaking, listening, walking, and thinking about teaching your pedagogies and your frameworks using the classroom spaces. And they look different for white folks doing soul work, it's both for Black people doing the soul work, but we all have to do this deep soul work and begin to redefine like what Blackness is. When I was teaching high school, I was also a full-time doc student. So I was learning and changing my teaching as I was learning in my doc program. And so I can remember sharing like CRT with my students, little passages, excerpts and passages from like scholarly articles. Dr. Boote and I met to talk about how can I teach Black language to my students. And so we talked about different ways to bring that into the classroom space. I didn't learn it in my graduate program, but I had to begin to change. I had to do that deep soul work to push back. And also doing this work as resistance. You can't do this work and be scared, right? You think about the work around Black linguistic justice and the work around critical race English education. It's a never scared pedagogy. You can't be scared to do this work. You have to be willing to resist and push back. So I go back to like, this is deep soul work. So first you gotta start with yourself first, and before you can help anybody else. So I'll just say that.
I like that. I just want to build on what Drs. Baker Bell and Johnson just said. I think that for me, one beginning point is to begin with the acceptance that African-American children, Black speakers, are not coming to the classroom on an empty slate. In fact, absolutely with more sophisticated experiences than what's going to be presented. And so they're already equipped with these skills. And what it means to build on that is to break this pattern of feeling like there's nothing there when it's to the contrary, everything that they need is there. In fact, much more than what's expected of other students. So accept the assets are there.
Thank you so much. I have another question. So we talked a lot about the historical, or Dr. Boote, did you have something to add for this one before I keep going?
I was going to say, I know you're going to send out resources, and I've sent some resources with examples of things that teachers are doing in their classroom. And I totally agree with what everybody's saying. As April said, I remember once we were doing a professional development around African-American language with teachers, and they told the students to not come there, but the students sort of wanted to know what was going on. They were eavesdropping. And when they heard us talk about the beauty of African-American language, one of the students said, I knew my language was something. She knew she had been abused, right? So so that's it. And there's a question I was replying to in the chat about should teachers correct the grammatical errors that African-American students are making. And I think I'll just start off with that one. But they're not grammatical errors if it's part of the language system. It is correct in African-American language. So I think what people struggle with is the idea of how do you add on another language? Because that is part of the conversation. And we know that the more languages you have, the stronger your cognitive skills are. So when we speak, we don't intend to imply that you never give children access to other languages. It's you honor the language they bring. You don't police it, as they said. And in fact, we all have the benefit of speaking African-American language and standardized English. That's an option for students as well. There are, ways that you can do that better than others. But when we think we're correcting them, in fact, we usually say, instead of saying correct, you might help students learn how to translate from one language system to the other. And but it's a very complex topic. I would just advise people to look at some of the resources. You will get the slides. There's a whole huge body of literature on this topic in terms of how you might go about adding on other languages without denigrating the language that exists.
And I would also add to that conversation, though, also keeping in mind, in this moment where we are talking about anti-Blackness, that we're I think, getting deeper into conversations and thinking about pedagogies that perpetuate anti-Blackness. And I think that it is uncomfortable with teachers to push beyond anti-Blackness that is perpetuated in some of our most progressive, pedagogies that are out there. For example, code switching is not the only option. That is not the only thing that's going to lead to success. There are many other options. I think, let Black people language. We language. That's what we're doing, right? And I think when we start to begin to build these new standards, that really police our language is so dynamic, and we all do it very differently, and we should be allowed to do it very differently like other people. And I think that, what I try to get out of with pedagogies is stop reproducing standards that really limits, the richness of, what Black children are able to do. When you just listen, I mean, those kids be flipping stuff so many different ways. It's over your head. You don't even know, what they're doing with language. And I think that, and I think young people are trying to move towards something very different. Some young folks that I've worked with aren't interested in code switching or feeling like they got to give up a part of their identity just to succeed. When they're watching white folks capitalize on their language and they're making, all types of businesses and all type of money, I think that Black children want to hear a different conversation. And so that's why, like in my work, I talk about what does it mean to have an anti-racist Black language pedagogy? What does it mean to be in conversation with youth to build the type of world that they want? Maybe it's not the world that I needed or that I lived in with my 20th century education, but what does it mean to have a 21st century Black language education that really honors where Black children are trying to go with their language? Some of them don't want to do what we did. They looking for something new. And I think they're right in that.
I just want to add that I think it's important to really underscore the richness of the language, the discourse aspect of the language, that it's not so much all the time what is said, but how it's said and the performative aspect of the language, which is why you would have a real strong platform to argue that a Langston Hughes is not employing African-American discourse, or Barack Obama, or Martin Luther King Jr. I think that's important to recognize the sound, the feel, what it evokes, and that our young people are indeed using African-American discourse styles and performance styles. That's important to play up and to recognize and honor as much as it is to the structure of the talk.
We have a lot of questions and answers coming in, so I'm going to shift to some of the questions that are starting to appear, because I think that some of them are, well, all of them are very rich for conversation. So one question submitted was, how do Black linguistic practices show up in disciplinary literacy, such as mathematics, science, and economics? Thinking of individuals such as Benjamin Banneker and George Washington Carver.
One work that comes to mind, I think, is Eleanor Orr's Twice as Less, just in the structure, that the ways in which the like formulas are structured and don't necessarily signal lack of understanding of the concept. And I think that that is something for teachers to grapple with when they're trying to assess how the extent to which a student knows something, to really be engaged in dialogue, because there are different ways of saying things, including in mathematic formulas.
Yeah, and I would just say that I think language is foundational to any discipline, and so like the language is going to be there. And so the same type of things that we're talking about, especially related to policing and those type of aspects, happens in all different disciplines. It happens if we think about it outside of schools, it happens in all type of community spaces, corporate, whatever, it's happening there. So I think that like that's the first step in any different discipline, is to make sure you're not policing, that you're listening for what students are actually saying. But then I think about the work of people like Chris Emden, who is thinking about science education and using hip hop. Well, we know that Black language is very central to hip hop, and he thinks about, Chris Emden, how he's using hip hop, to teach science. And so I think that has everything to do, with Black language. I've had people reach out to me since my book has come out. There's someone in math education and talking about the way Black children move and the way they talk about math using their mother tongue, is extremely important. And so how, it's important that we're thinking about Black language and literacies in these contexts too, to better understand what are kids doing and how are they talking about math. They may be doing something or talking in a way that you might not understand, especially thinking about what the discourse features that were just brought up, right? And they're actually engaging in the subject, at hand, but they're using their mother tongue. So I think it's just important to keep these same principles across the board in honoring language. It could do so much, in any type of discipline, when we're not policing and we're allowing the richness of their language to be there and for them to not feel uncomfortable when doing that.
And I'll add and say what April and everyone has said about looking at writing and literacy and language across multiple disciplines. That is not only an English language arts classroom, that we all have writing standards, we all have like literacy standards. And so thinking about planning thematically, if you're teaching science or if you're teaching like 12th grade anatomy or even biology, you can engage your students, like April said, in hip hop. You can have them to do like, you're talking about the types of bones in the body. They can learn about breakdancing, which connects to hip hop, which connects to Black language. And then you could have them to talk, maybe outline their bodies in a breakdance move, talk about like that in their own Black language. So I think many ways to do this. I think we have to go back to, if you begin to use the radical imagination, you have to blow up what you haven't started new. That means deconstructing your curriculum. That means constructing new curriculum. It also means like reconstructing the curriculum too. So you have to be willing to go back and really know how to infuse the traditional standards with the creativity too. So you have to be a student and know how to do that, which goes back to like doing like the deep soul work and being willing to resist and try things and know that it may not go right the first time. But what I noticed when I was teaching in high school, that Black students already know that, that they do have a language. And so often we're told that we don't, like Dr. Boote said, they know that it's a language. So what I was doing teaching, I was just affirming them, like, you're right, this is a language. So I'm teaching subject verb agreement for these standards. I'm also gonna bring in like Black language too and talk about how SVA actually looks within Black language. And I did just that. Pronoun antecedent, I'm gonna critique pronoun antecedent through white mainstream English. If you're saying like everybody needs to bring his or her pencil, in Black language, we're gonna say everybody needs to bring their pencil. But even if you think about the whole his and her thing, right? If you have students who are gender fluid. So we even can talk about that when we think about language and white mainstream English. So if I'm teaching high school right now, even teaching my pre-service teachers, we have these conversations. So it's very important, but you have to be willing to resist and know how to we have to start anew. That means blowing up your curriculum and starting again.
And it's so fun.
And I'd like to co-narrate on that as well. I agree. I think the answer is in what you said. You could also just ask the students what they think, how their language can be used across these different disciplinary areas.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to add too that this is a wonderful space to actually enhance the criticality of young people, engage them in conversations, because we should. I love what you just said, Dr. Johnson, about blowing it up, because we should have young people engage in conversations about what does math sound like? What does science sound like? What does the language sound like? It doesn't have to sound the way that they've been socialized. We've been indoctrinated to think. So I just wanted to add that, make it critical.
Yeah, and Dr. Peel, Edie and I were sort of having a offline conversation. So if you go out and get that book by Orr, Twice as Less, just be sure to read it critically, because there have been some critiques about her misunderstanding of how African-American language speakers understand function and things like that. A lot of her interpretations were kind of off. So read several sources. There are lots of sources out there.
And last thing, when I was also teaching freshman English, we were on like team teaching. which is new for high school teachers. And so I remember our first unit was on identity, and they were going off what I was doing with my students. And so I remember the math teacher doing some of the imaginary numbers. And I can't do all that, but like 1 means something and 0 meant something. But we talked about like the identity, we connected to humanity, and the students got it right away. It's just, you have to go through and do some different type of planning.
And you know, when you're talking about, you know, earlier you were talking about loving Blackness and sort of delving deeply. I mean, in both math and science, there's ethnomathematics, ethnoscience, where you can take advantage of the culture of the students to teach. And some of the examples that you gave them are really good ones, like, you know, using things like graffiti and breakdancing. And I mean, in mathematics, for example, if you look culturally, there are lots of ways to teach about geometry based on Black culture. So there are lots of ways of making connections. And as April pointed out with Chris Emden's work in science, so just be open to the possibilities of what's out there.
Yeah, and I'll add one thing, and then we can move on to the next question. I'm homeschooling my son right now, who is, he's 7. And I think about like the story problems, even for his age, like I reinvent the entire curriculum because the story problems aren't relevant. Not only just because he's Black, it ain't relevant to the times. They were talking about CDs. We were listening to CDs back in the 90s. Ain't nobody listening. My son's like, what's a CD? So he's caught up on a CD and not the story problem. And so what I had to do was just reinvent, you know, the entire story problem to make it more relevant to who he is as a Black child, you know, to make it relevant to his language and his literacy practices. And once I was able to do that and take advantage of that, like what Lamar is getting in, it helped me very much so in developing, thinking about the radical imagination. So many of these things don't exist. Like we're arguing for, you know, a Black linguistic justice for Black language and literacies, but many of these things don't exist in our own discipline, right? And so like, it certainly is not going to exist in necessarily math or science. Some people are doing it without naming it, those things, and it's happening. But like, yeah, you have to reinvent everything. I'm like, let me toss these story problems because he's never going to get the concept with these irrelevant things, irrelevant to the time, to the region, you know, to his Blackness. And so I think like, you have to be creative. And that's the one thing as a high school English language arts teacher, listening to Lamar speak, I had to create everything, you know, because it's just like my kids were not going to learn with the textbooks and the curriculum that we were given. And you just have to reinvent. And that's what I think lead people like us to this moment to be able to talk about it, because we've been innovators, you know, from the very beginning. You just have to innovate everything when you're working with Black people and Black kids.
Mm-hmm. I know we're moving on, but I just have one last thing to say, because you hit on that, Dr. Becker Bell, because at the root of this is being able to dialogue with Black kids and not be afraid of them, to engage them, to understand them, to actually know what they think, because you can't get access to not understanding of what a CD is if you're afraid to actually sit next to a Black kid. And that's where it requires us to just get to the root of what anti-Black is. What's there is just this fear, not just to minimize, but it's this fear, this very fear of Black young people.
So, okay. So I just have to say this. I think that's why it's important people like pre-service teachers people who are preparing pre-service teachers to basically have things like some thematic sequence. When you have candidates come through the education programs, taking certain courses, mandated courses, you know, having a course on, you know, Black language, having a course on critical whiteness studies in education, having a course on CRT, and you can't go forward until you take these 3 or 4 mandated courses. So I think we also look at ourselves as pre-service teachers who are preparing these people to go out in these classrooms. Because oftentimes we see a lot of our colleagues are not doing the work that we're doing. And so these people are going out there not loving on, you know, our Black and brown babies. So we talk about like loving Blackness to death. I think we need to talk about like also loving Blackness to life too. And what does that mean for us? And that means that we as teacher educators have to go through our own soul work and deep transformation.
I love the conversation. It's okay. Feel free to keep on. We have a lot of questions now. They are just coming in as you all are talking. More and more questions are producing. So I'll try to cover as many as I can in the time that we have. So this question says, can you say more about formal and standard Black language? Slang and informality are highlighted far more than formal Black language. Can you recommend sources that highlight formal Black language? Black folks have formal and informal language practices in our own right. For example, we have begun to hear about Black churches. Formal Black language occurs in Black churches and other settings.
That sounds like code switching to me, but I'll let April.
No, we can go together. We could co-dialogue this one. Well,
Go ahead.
the one thing that I want to say about, I think what's happening in this conversation is concerning, because I don't know Dr. Boote's work, I don't know Dr. Pilaides's work. I know their work. What I'm saying, I don't know of anyone to only focus on slang in their work, Dr. Johnson. I think that we just talked about discourse features. We talk about the fullness of Black language. I think that there's a misconception that Black language is slang, and we tend to reduce it in our thinking and only think about the slang features. It's also concerning because I feel like we're trying to reproduce the same standards that white people does with language, and it just separate things. Black people language, and we know that the way you say something to your grandma and the way you say it to your friend might not be the same. We know that kind of stuff, right? But I get concerned that what we do is take the standards that white culture developed that's really divisive to divide people, and we take it back to Black language and then our language is sophisticated. It's hard to break it down to even say formal and informal registers. And what are we doing it for, right? Anyway, because I attended Black churches, and it wasn't just like this formality type of, we languaged in the Black churches, right? It's just languaging. And I just wish we could appreciate it instead of taking these white concepts and reproducing it in Black people. We are complex. Black people, we don't take these standards and we don't do this among each other. So I just want to caution us that we're not taking and thinking and trying to separate Black standard from some type of Black non-standard language to reproduce this hierarchy that we're trying to work against. And so that's the first thing I want to say with that. Like, what is the meaning of the question? For what reasons? There are works of people who do talk about like Black standard language. And I think that work is to push back against folks who try to limit our stuff to just slang and informal registers. There are some scholars that talk about it. You could look in the linguistic history, but please, let's not take that conversation just to reproduce a standard then to say to a Black child, you're speaking informal Black language. So therefore, it's troubling. And so that's my thing that I want to caution against.
Beautifully stated.
That's nothing to add to that.
Nothing.
Sorry, I didn't mean to take the,
I think it's important. I mean, just as an example, because the church was given as one, I mean, something as simple as the word, as complex as the word amen, the languaging part of it can be used to throw a lot of shade and has nothing to do with formality. Okay. And in terms of I'm actually struggling with what we want to say and what we mean by the formality. So that would be helpful to add in the chat. What exactly is formal? What exactly is informal? I think the same can be said about schooling or an education. I find that I always struggle there. But Black language in the Black church discourse is so complex in that way that what gets used even during something like prayer, and I have anything to do with prayer at all, might be, a lot of other kinds of back channeling and all kinds of things are happening in Black language, Black church language especially. I just want to say, I mean, because of the interest of time, I didn't get a chance to highlight like how some of this language unfolds. How do Sunday school teachers give access to these strategies, these devices, these understandings to young people in the church context? But it's in that piece that I referenced there, but it's much more multiple meanings. It's so complex. I don't think we can actually tag anything as formal, even what's happening in the pulpit, because that too is conveying a lot of other things.
So I can probably grab one last one from the comments. So given that a lot of states, a lot of school districts have been engaging in focuses of equity, how much reinvention of the curriculum do you think is actually feasible within these schooling spaces in today's current schooling system?
I mean, I don't know. I'm not sure if I'm coming at the question, correct. I think that like what the push is for in terms of curriculum is asking a question, does your curriculum honor Black children in their full humanity? I think that's the goal. Like, I think that's the goal, and that's the push, what we're talking about through, language and literacy. So thinking about your curriculum and how do you honor Black children in their full humanity, and not getting caught up in like, these pushes for, pushes for equity is great, don't get me wrong, but I think the push for equity is to honor them in their full humanity. I think that's the thing. And so like, if you use that lens to begin to look at your curriculum and critique your curriculum and just the environmental experiences that you're providing in the classroom space with young people, I think that's a great lens. Then you don't feel overwhelmed with so many things coming at you, right? I think that you have to have your own criticality, your own lens, to this work, because there are some things like, for example, right now, it's concerning about equity and anti-racism. Folks, it's a new anti-racism, you know what I'm saying? And then there's some of us that are reconnecting with folks who before there was even a term of anti-racism, people like Carter G. Woodson and Dr. G and them were telling us what to do a long time ago, right? So I think that like, you might get something that says it's anti-racist, for example, where it's equitable, and it might not be. And that's why I think, getting back to what Dr. Johnson and others are pointing out, that you have to be willing to love on Blackness. You have to be willing to love on Black people and Black children. And the goal is to honor them in their full humanity and flip your curriculum to make sure it's doing that. If whatever's coming at you through the schools, if they're talking about some model, of anti-racism that's being sold and you need to bring that criticality to make sure it is going to honor Black children in their full humanity, and it's not going to sidestep it, right? So I think that's how I come at that question. Not sure if I answered it correctly, but honor Black kids in their full humanity, language, literacies, joy, brilliance, every aspect of them, and ask them. That's the thing. We don't ask kids about like, how are you experiencing the curriculum? How are you experiencing this pedagogy? Like, I do my stuff all of my work develops in conversation and in community with Black children. That gets you somewhere. Like, we can't just make assumptions in our head that we're honoring Black kids and we're not asking them, well, how are you experiencing this? What do you want to see? I think that those basic questions, or maybe not so basic questions, are things that you should be engaging young people in, and try to build that community where they feel that they're part of creating the education and building the world that they want to exist in the future.
And I'll even add to that just briefly, thinking about when I was teaching, once again, I had to ask myself, like, how are you using your body to shape the foundation of white supremacy? Are you putting yourself and your body on the front lines for your Black kids and youth? Because I know what it felt like to be a Black boy sitting in those desks each year. I know what it felt like. So at the end of the day, I didn't have to ask any questions. I was just doing it. Once go back to again to whole resistant, you have to resist and know that this is resistant work, and to disrupt. And there are many ways to disrupt. And like Dr. Baker Bell just said, I was given, curriculum to follow. I was told to use textbooks, and I was like, I'm not getting a textbook. And the principal said, you should get the textbooks. I said, well, I'm leaving it in front of my classroom. And that's exactly what I did. And I had great test scores each year, and I didn't have honor students. And so, because I use a textbook as a way to critique it in a sense, so I'm going to create a thematic unit around, teenage love affair. When we teach Julius Caesar or Shakespeare, teenage love affair, Romeo and Juliet. I'm going to bring in Drake to teach metaphors, similes. I'm going to bring in Alicia Keys, because they talk about like love and teenage love affair. And the metaphor is always a metaphor, similes always similes. Those things don't change. But I know how to take the standardized test at the end of each year. So if I want to see, did you really master, these literary devices? Then I'll go and pull this textbook, these 5 questions around literary devices. And that's what I would do, to put these things in conversation with one another. But I have to be willing to not be afraid to shape the foundation of white supremacy. And I did have my principal and department chairs coming from me. I was a younger teacher. They were older. And so I had to be willing to speak up for myself, like, okay, you're right. However, here's some new theories we can look at: culture relevant pedagogy, culture sustaining pedagogy, CRT. Let's talk about it. So I'm going to put an article in your mailbox and say, hey, I put an article in your mailbox after the conversation we had earlier. You want to talk about it? Hit me up. Did anybody hit me up? Not really. But I think that's what we have to do. So that's why I teach my pre-service teachers and graduate students. Like, when you go into these spaces, there are many ways to disrupt, but you have to be willing to put your body on the front line, but also to shape the foundation of white supremacy at this particular point. We don't have time to wait at this point.
And Dr. Johnson, could you talk a little bit? It's a question related to that, is how do you do this in a diverse setting, racially diverse setting? And you had a racially diverse setting.
It was very racially diverse. And I feel like I do now at Michigan State, a white space, center Blackness to the Black gaze. I talk about critical whiteness with my high school students and with my college students, but it's definitely going to be from this particular Black gaze. Because I don't think you talk about like anti-Blackness or whiteness without talking about like Blackness. And for me, I'm centering Blackness from the get-go. And if I center Blackness and if I center Black people, particularly like Black women and Black girls, I'm going to cover everybody. And that's just how I approach my particular space, to be honest with you. I don't have anything else to say, but that's how I approach it.
I can say, I want to just add to that, and I know we got to go, but in the context of language, thinking about solidarities across various language groups, and I mean, I think is a great approach that you could take, especially in a multiracial, multilingual, type of setting. I would just shout out the work of Danny Martinez, who talks about a language of solidarity across Latinx and Black youth. I use Danny's work in my class. I use Kyle Mays. He talks about language of solidarity across Black and Indigenous youth, or Indigenous people in general. And those are some great things, because I think what we have to understand is, like, we have unique experiences with language. Anti-Black linguistic racism is a unique experience specifically to Black people, but it is also connected to the larger linguistic discrimination that happens across communities. And I think it's important for young Black people, young brown people, young Indigenous people to know how other communities of color experience this version of linguistic discrimination or linguistic racism, because they have to understand that all of this falls under the umbrella of white supremacy, right? And that there are other people who, like, we're not separate from them in that, right? And I think the better that we get with solidarity across communities, the better chance we get to, interrupt, dismantle, and take down this idea of white supremacy. So, like, though I center Blackness and love Black people to life, to death, and to whatever, I know it's also important for us to, be in conversation with our other, communities of color. And I'm in conversation with them on a scholarly front, the research front, and also making sure that we're doing that in the classrooms, in the communities, that we're talking about what it means to experience anti-Black linguistic racism, what we could do to dismantle it, but it also connects with these other communities we have to be in solidarity with.
And if white students are in the class, they need to be educated as well.
Oh, yeah.
Because that's really how white supremacy manifests itself. So they're not learning. They need to learn to love the language. And
they do, and not that they do everywhere, but Dr. Johnson, like what he pointed out at MSU, I mean, we take it on. We take it on, and I'm gonna be honest, don't be afraid of it. We center Blackness. They definitely know me and Dr. Johnson at Michigan State. They trying to take our classes. They want to be in there because we disrupt. We come, we don't sugarcoat. We don't do any of that stuff. We come and we bring it. You got to understand the anti-Blackness. You got to do the soul work, and white students, I'm not saying you don't get some in there, but the majority of our students come and they're ready to, I'm not saying they come ready to do the work, but by the time they out of our class, they definitely trying to do that work. And so don't be afraid to center Blackness. My pedagogy does not change based on the audience. I'm going to come and bring it, whether you white, Black, brown, Indigenous, Asian, whatever, you're going to get it.
Let me shout out USC as well. Same thing. We have a majority white population, but particularly our urban cohort, we come strong, but in all of our courses, this is required content.
So I'm sorry to cut the conversation short. We had such a great conversation about this. So we hope that you enjoyed the wealth of information that was shared tonight. I want to thank the panelists again for your scholarship, for your work, for your dedication, and living what you're saying that you want to see in your scholarship too. When you end this webinar, there will be prompts requesting your feedback and an invitation to review resources around tonight's topic. I know a lot of people have been in the chats and in question and answer asking, where can I find this? Where can I see this? So you will have resources that are available for you around tonight's topic. We appreciate for you to pause and take the survey and review the resources shared by tonight's presenters. Lastly, we hope many of you can join tomorrow at 3 p.m. for the post discussion. So I will continue on with the questions that have been posed in the question and answer tomorrow for a larger conversation. Information will be included in the survey, or you can go to education.iupui.edu. This concludes our webinars. Stay safe and have a good night.